All right, we are back in the book of 1 Thessalonians this morning. Hope you're enjoying our tour through 1 Thessalonians. If you're not, you should probably get used to it. We're going to be here for quite a while. We took the slow path, so we're not going to cover a lot of ground any time, but we're going to cover it thoroughly is the goal. As we do, let me start off with a couple memory verses. I want to review our January memory verse, especially if you weren't here or you've forgotten. It was a short one, but an important one. Would you read it with me? 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 21. Test all things, hold fast what is good. That's good advice, wouldn't you agree? Test all things, hold fast what is good. And then, as I said, we're going to do a different memory verse every month just to keep it fresh, because honestly, if I gave you like the next 3 months to memorize that verse and you didn't, that would be very lame. Can we agree with that? Okay, so this one's a little bit longer, but would you read it with me? It's our new verse for the month of February, chapter 2 and verse 4. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. There's a few more words in that verse. Some of you are panicked already. Don't. It's okay. You will get there. How many of you have ever endured a thunderstorm? Thunderstorms are kind of interesting because they're almost mislabeled, aren't they? You think about it, what role does thunder play in a thunderstorm? An active role or a passive role? Passive, right? Because thunder, if you think with me here for science, I know it's like Sunday and you're not expecting science, but thunder doesn't appear first. In fact, thunder is a result or a consequence of something else. Thunder is the sound of lightning. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Lightning is the source. Lightning is the event. Lightning is the action. Thunder just happens. So you could actually call it, and they do in some places, a lightning storm, not a thunderstorm. And it would probably be a better label, wouldn't you agree? Because, we're labeling it off of like the passive consequence, thing that happened because of the lightning. That actually has a little bit of bearing here as we begin. Because so much of our lives as Christians, I've stood up here now for 11 full years. I'm in my 12th year, if you can believe that. Does that sound right? 2006, 2017, 11 years? Yeah. So, 12 going to 13, however that plays out. Obviously, I'm sciencing, not mathing today. But one of the things that we get trapped in, and this that was really a distraction, but one of the things that we get kind of trapped in is the responsibility, nay, the obligation that we have to act, to be active in our Christian life. We need to do more. We need to do better. You think about reading your Bible. It's something you have to do. It's an action you have to take. We think about praying, and it's an action that we have to do. It's something that we have to do. You think about sharing the gospel. We've talked about, and we're going to continue to talk about it this morning. And it feels like something that's very active, like it's the lightning. And what we sometimes and generally do miss is that all of these things are actually the thunder. The lightning is something that is active, that happens to us. Reading our Bible, praying, sharing our faith, the whole of our Christian life is thunder. It's really, in many respects, it's passive. It's a result of something that happened to us. God acted on us. God acts through us. All these other things that we try so hard to do, sometimes we fail at them because we're trying too hard. It's supposed to flow a little more naturally through us, like thunder. And maybe there's some help in there. But we look at 1 Thessalonians, and we're just going to cover verses 6 through 10 this morning. And actually, I want to get a running start. I'm going to back up to verse 5, the tail end of it. Paul is writing still kind of almost introductorily to the Thessalonians. He's still kind of, this is still the text that we sum up as, Dear Church at Thessalonica is how we'd start this. This is kind of that piece of it still. Still kind of laying the groundwork for what he really wants to get to saying. But he begins talking with them about their conversion experience, about them coming to Christ, about the belief that for many of them is still relatively new. Think with me again. How long was the Apostle Paul in the city of Thessalonica? And the answer is just under 4 weeks. Very short amount of time that he spent there in the city. And so many of these people had not had a long time with him, had not had a long time hearing from him. Now, Barnabas went back, Timothy went back, others went back. Paul would eventually go back himself and give what instruction they could to shore up and teach the church there. But he begins reflecting on their experience with him. And he says it this way, beginning in the end of verse 5, he says, You know what kind of men we were among you for your sake. And you became followers of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much affliction with joy of the Holy Spirit. You know, he says to the church there, you know what kind of man I am, what kind of things I taught, what kind of way I lived. He says, you know that. The church there had observed Paul, and they had observed his teaching, and they had observed his living. There is necessarily a sympathetic relationship between what we say and what we do. That is just, it's natural, it's normal, it's expected, and it's expectable, I think. I don't think that we have, I don't think we have credibility when our life and our lessons diverge too far. It's like the completely incredulous moment, and I've told you the story before, that I was working with the guy who virtually lived like a pagan. I mean, literally he did anything and everything that he wanted. He was completely compromised by his own appetites. You've met these kinds of people, yes? And so this is the way he lived. But he said to me in the confines of a truck as we were on our way to a job site, he says, I have strong beliefs. I just don't let them impact the way I live my life. I literally almost fell through a closed door into the road. I was so shocked and so surprised that such stupidity could come out of one person's mouth. I say, that's not very nice. No, it's not, but you should hear what I'm not saying. I have strong beliefs. I just don't let them impact how I live my life. No, that means you have no idea how you're living, because we live out the beliefs that we have necessarily. And our lessons, the things that we're trying to share with people have to have a certain amount of alignment with the way we live our lives. And the wider the divergence between what we say and what we do, that gap is our credibility stretching to the point of breaking. And so Paul says, look, you observed me. You know what kind of person I was. You heard what I said, and you watched what I did. Having observed Paul and his teaching, he says, you received. They received Paul's teaching, having duly considered it and having duly considered the life of the person who was delivering that message. He says, look, you literally, the word he uses here is you became a mimic. In most of our Bibles it says you became followers. It's the word it comes from is the word that we get our word mimic from, the root word we get mime from, these kinds of things. The idea of, you think about it, if you are some pagan living off on, some Greek place with Greek gods and Greek attitudes and Greek culture and Greek behaviors, and suddenly you're going to come to Christ, how do you know what that means? How do you know what to do with that? The normal, natural pattern is you look for somebody and you kind of walk after them. Paul says, look, you became followers. Literally, you became a mimic of me. You began teaching the message that I taught you. You began living the life that I modeled for you. Now, there's part of that today says, wow, that's kind of disingenuous, isn't it? Like, that's kind of fake and phony. But is it really? How many of you have certain character traits that are very closely resemble those of your parents? And not the things that they said, but it was the things that they did. Parents, you understand this. You ever looked at your children and say, do as I say, not as I do? That's not being, pharisaical. It's like we want them to live better lives than we lived. I want my kids to not have all of the appetites that I do. So by all means, please do the things that I say. I'm working on them too. And give grace where life doesn't quite measure up. Again, that gap. But we do things, we say things, we live our lives according to the patterns of the people around us. This is normal. It's natural. I mean, if it didn't, who taught you to walk? Mom and Dad. You walk the way they walk. And I still, even at my age, I catch myself having actions, statements, attitudes that reflect my parents. Sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're like, oh, I wish I had never learned that. And I hear enough laughter to know that some of you are in the same boat. And so they mimic. They literally followed Paul in both his teaching and in his living, and he was fine with it. He was okay with that. That was a good thing. Here's a truth that we need to kind of wrap our heads around. Very often, people will follow the Lord if they can follow his spokesman. If they can't follow his servant, then they won't follow him. And whether that should be true or not is frankly irrelevant, because it simply is. It's the statement, I would be a Christian if it weren't for the Christians I know. Regardless of who you ascribe authorship to that is, it's true. People are looking at us, people are looking at Christ's followers and saying, I would be a Christian, but I just can't roll like you roll. I don't want to be who you are. I can't follow you. And if that's what following God looks like, then I guess I can't follow him. Whether it should be true or not is irrelevant. It is. And this is what Paul said to the Thessalonians. You became followers of me. You began to mimic me. You looked at what I lived and you listened to what I said, and you were able to get behind that and fall in step with that. So they became, or they were mimics. And then he goes on in verse 7 to say that they became models. There's a transference that happens here between the life and ministry and message of the Apostle Paul that flows from him to the church at Thessalonica. Look what he said in verse 7. So that you became examples to all in Macedonia and Achaia who believe. You became examples. Having adopted Paul's teaching and living, they accepted the responsibility of modeling that, both his message and his way of life, to the people around them, the same way that Paul had to them. So it's not enough to say, oh, our leaders must live this way. To say that we follow God means that we're going to collectively accept the responsibility to live it in front of people. To become a model. Now, the word model here is a fantastic word. It means to strike. And the actual idea that was probably in Paul's mind is that of a wax seal. Have you ever seen wax seals? Are very cool. They're very retro, very vintage. I get that, but a wax seal, you take a big fat crayon basically, and you hold it over the flame, and you push it into the parchment, and then you take your seal, usually metal, sometimes stone, and you push it in. Whether it's a ring or a press, you push it in, and it makes your stamp there in the wax, and you pull it out, and it cools and it hardens, and that seal says, "I signed this." So like if I had one, it would have like a DP or something on it, and you stamp it, and you would look at it, and everybody would know, hey, that's his seal. He wrote that. The picture that's probably, and so he's saying to them, you became examples. You became a seal, an image of my ministry, and that's huge. The word also has the idea and it's the word, the definition or the idea that I gravitate to of being a Jell-O mold. You remember Jell-O molds? Now, some of you are younger enough that you didn't know that you could actually mold Jell-O. At least in my house, Jell-O's molded to whatever container we happen to chuck it in. But back in the day, there was this company called Tupperware. And it's before Pampered Chef. And Tupperware had all kinds of plastic things coming out of World War II, just fantastic. You need ways to store stuff. People were beginning to buy refrigerators. In our mindset, that doesn't even calculate that we would be buying a refrigerator. But it didn't used to be a given that everybody had a fridge in their house. You can't make Jell-O without a refrigerator. And so this was just one of those new cool things. And so Tupperware came out with ways that you could store your food in the refrigerator. And then, storage was a necessity. And then they started adding to that kind of cool things, at least in their mind. And one of those kind of cool things was a Jell-O mold. Now, a Jell-O mold is this large bowl, and it usually had, ridges on the bowl, and it had a bottom thing that you could change, a little piece that fitted on the bottom like a lid, except it wasn't the lid, it was the bottom, and it let you change the imprint that you were going to put. So what you would do is you would choose your imprint, you would put it on the thing, you'd make your Jell-O, and you would pour it into the Jell-O mold, and you'd fill it up. Once it's set, you would turn it upside down, and you would pop the Jell-O out, and the Jell-O would be jiggling all over the place, and it would look like the bowl. It'd have these nice little ridges around it, and this cool little imprint in the now top that you had from the lid. This is a Jell-O mold. And so the Jell-O would come out looking like the mold. Makes sense, right? Even if you haven't seen it, do you understand what I'm talking about? Some of you are like so millennial, you have no idea. All right, somebody needs to bring a Jell-O mold to the Super Bowl party. So anyway, does anybody actually still own a Jell-O mold? Let me put my hand down because I don't. Okay, no Jell-O molds at the Super Bowl party. We just don't have them. But this is the idea. And so the Jell-O would look like the mold. And this is what it is to be an example. Is I am going to come out looking like the thing that I follow. I'm going to come out looking like the thing I was poured into. I'm going to be the jiggly Jell-O that looks like the mold. In our case, the mold is Jesus, and we're the jiggly Jell-O that looks like him. That's the idea of being an example, of being molded in his image. That's literally what it means. And so they became an example. They became a model. They became a jiggly Jell-O mold for the city of Thessalonica. But it didn't just stop there. He said, you've become an example, notice what he says, to all in Macedonia and Achaia. Now, Macedonia isn't a city. Macedonia is a region. And so you get Thessalonica, it's a city in this region of Macedonia. And he says, you've become a model. You've become an example, not just to your city, but to your region. Achaia was the region next to Macedonia. Between these two regions, they occupied an area of several hundred miles. Do you hear the impact that this church was having? You have become an example. You have become a model, not just to the people in Thessalonica. That would have been an accomplishment in and of itself. He said, you have become a model, an example to the entire region and the region next to you. People for hundreds of miles know who you are, what you stand for, and what you teach. People for hundreds of miles look to you as an example. And this is a very impressive model that the Thessalonians had. An impressive amount of influence that the Macedonians had. In fact, you could look at this statement of Mesopotamia and Achaia and say that really encompasses the entire area of Paul's second missionary journey. It's like, you are the crowning achievement of my life's work. That's how well you've embraced and modeled what I've going on. And then he says, not just that, but literally to everywhere. That they became a model to Christians, to pagans, to everybody, everywhere around. They became a model. Not surprising then, in becoming a model, especially as effective and widespread model as they were really turned into megaphones. We see that in verses 8 through 10, he continues to compliment them, but continue to share the nature of their ministry. Look what he said in verse 8. For from you, from the church at Thessalonica, the word of the Lord has sounded forth not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith toward God has gone out, so that we do not need to say anything. For they themselves, the people who are hearing and seeing the model that you are, they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. The word of the Lord sounded forth, and the word there, sound, means literally to thunder, to roll like thunder. From the point of the lightning strike outward in all directions, the word of the Lord literally thundered from you. And he also said, your faith has gone out. Now, when you read both of those expressions, they are both passive, which is intriguing to me. Your faith has gone out. It isn't you sent your faith out. Your faith has gone out. It has done something passively. You see, the church at Thessalonica, they simply lived their faith. That was what they did. They lived their faith. They shared what was on their heart and mind to share. This is natural for us, right? We talk about the weather when we're bored and uninteresting and have nothing else to talk about, right? I'm sorry if that's all you talk about, but that's the reality. We talk about today, we're talking about the Patriots because we're all excited about this little football game that's going to happen, right? Some of you aren't, and I get that. I respect that. Fine. We talk about politics because it impacts our lives, because it's something that we become passionate about. We talk about horses. We talk about hobbies. We talk about gymnastics. Oh, do we talk about gymnastics around here? Because it's something that we are passionate about, something that we are involved in. Now, how many of you, some of you might do this, so just work with me here. You set out in the morning and you say, I'm going to talk to so-and-so about gymnastics today. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to talk to so-and-so about gymnastics today. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to talk to so-and-so about gymnastics today. Or horses today. Or fishing today. Or politics today. Or the Patriots. If you start your day that way, we need to chat because you have too much time on your hands. And I got stuff you can do for me. We don't start our day that way, but because it's in our heart and it's in our head, it just kind of happens, doesn't it? Right? Is this true? Is this your experience? This is the Thessalonian experience. They lived out their faith because it was important to them. They shared their faith not as an unnatural thing. Oh, I have to go talk to so-and-so because they're going to hell and I need to tell them that. And I need to go talk to No. They shared their faith as something completely natural because it was in their head and it was in their heart and it was important to them. And it just came out. It wasn't an active, oh, you need to know. There was no points, there was no steps. It was just, this is what's going on in me that I'm sharing with you because it's going on in me. It's passive. It's not active. It just kind of happens. It's the thunder rolling because the lightning struck. And the thunder rolled through Macedonia and Achaia. And as a result of their thunder, the Apostle Paul says, your message has gone out. Your faith has gone out. Your thunder has been heard far and wide. So much so that the Apostle Paul said, I don't even need to tell anybody anything. I don't need to go out and tell people about the gospel because they've already heard. I don't need to go to the marketplace and explain things that nobody's ever heard of before because everybody in the market has heard your thunder. He says, you've stolen my thunder, quite literally. I've got nothing left that I need to say to people because they're getting it from you. You're already introducing Jesus naturally, organically to the people around you because you're living your life and because it's important to you, it's in your head, it's in your heart, and it just comes out. The whole region had not converted, but the whole region had heard. And that's really our responsibility, isn't it? Is to share. Conversion is between a person and God. But sharing what God has done with us, that's between us and everybody else. And Paul looked at the church there and he said, you've become a megaphone. People have heard your thunder far and wide. And I think sometimes, and this is a self-indictment as much as a group indictment, so don't hear me as superior, hear me as in the same pit you are. I think sometimes we don't share because it's not in our head and it's not in our heart and it's not that important to us. And we can all say ouch together. But I think that's what happens. The volume of the Thessalonian thunder really demonstrates three truths to me. And Paul sums it up here in these last couple of verses. First of all, he says that their thunder demonstrated the effectiveness of Paul's ministry in both word and deed and his model of being a model. Paul, when you look at the ministry he had, didn't do it like everybody else did. It was a lot more effective than the way most people were. But the Thessalonians, both them coming to Christ and them sharing Christ in the whole region, validated the effectiveness of Paul's ministry and Paul's model of just going in, being myself, sharing what God has done with the people around me as it comes up. Living out my life the way God wants me to, not telling people they have to live like I do, just living it. Not fake, not phony, genuine, flawed, fallen, admitting all of that. How many super Christians have you ever met that you wanted to throttle? Because it's fake, it's phony. Am I perfect? No. Am I forgiven? Thank God, yes. Do I need that forgiveness a lot? Yeah. More than I should? Yeah. Do I let other people know that? Yeah. Because where that gap is between my life and my message, I don't want my credibility to be stretched to the breaking point, but I'm going to say, look, I'm human. I messed this up as bad as anybody else. You're going to see a gap. I wish it was small, but it's not. I just hope it hasn't gone so far that I have no credibility left. And so I live my life to try to shrink that gap and be as credible as I can, be as real as I can. But the reality is I'm not perfect. And so their thunder validated the effectiveness of Paul's ministry and his model. Their thunder also validated the reality of their own conversion. How do we know that the Thessalonians really got it? How do we know that they had come to Christ and that they believed the right thing? The evidence was written all over their lives. The fact that they lived the way that they lived and shared the things that they shared was a demonstration of the reality of their conversion. You meet somebody who just lives the gospel, who shares the gospel not in a forced way, but in an organic, engaging way. When you meet that person, you don't sit back and go, I wonder if they're really a Christian. Right? You meet somebody who feels like they got to force it, and they're going to tell you what they think and tell you what they believe and tell you how you have to live. And you look at their life and it doesn't quite measure up. You have to wonder if they got it? I do. because their brand doesn't look like mine. There are ways to tell. The thunder of the Thessalonians, as it rumbled through their region, testified to the reality of their own conversion. And then finally, the rumble of their thunder testified to the anticipation of their deliverance. The Thessalonians were not just living in and for this life. The Thessalonians had a shifted perspective that said, Jesus is coming again, that He's coming back soon, that He's going to deliver us from the wrath to come, that this life is not all that there is, that there's something bigger and something better and something else that my life is waiting for and going to be caught up in. The thunder of the Thessalonians testified they anticipated a deliverance, that they lived in hope that Jesus was coming again. Sometimes we get so caught up in this life and so complaining about all of the things that we don't have and all of the things that people said about us and all the things that people think about us, and our vision is so horizontal that it demonstrates that we don't have any anticipation of a deliverance. There's nothing vertical in our vision, nothing that lifts our eyes heavenward to say that this life is not all there is, that the struggles that I live with here are passing, they're fleeting, they're temporary. That God has so much more waiting and in store. That my life is bigger than what I live. It's got a bigger purpose and a greater significance. We turn our eyes vertical. Kind of reminded of a story I heard one time of an exchange that took place, and I can't tell you it's true or fabricated, but it was interesting. An exchange that took place in a women's dormitory of a concentration camp in Germany. Many Jews in those concentration camps, should not surprise us, lost a measure of their faith as they were stripped of their humanity. The story says there was one little girl who clung to her faith, who prayed, who was demonstrably and verbally thankful. Finally, one of the older women who had long since lost her faith came to the girl and says, "What do you have to be thankful for in this place?" And the girl looked at her and said, "I have to be thankful that I'm not like one of them." That's the difference between a horizontal focus and a vertical focus. Stripped of humanity, stripped of all of the niceties of life, reduced to living worse than animals, that a person could say, "I'm not like my captors, and so I have something to be thankful for." That is a perspective shift that we desperately need. The anticipation of our deliverance that elevates our entire life. The Apostle Paul said to the Thessalonians, "Your thunder has rolled throughout the region in testimony that you anticipate a deliverance, that you have hope." It's a funny thing about hope, and Paul would later say this. Hope isn't hope if we have what we want. Hope is only hope if we don't have it yet. That confident expectation says something's coming, but it's not here yet. How do we live our lives? What words come out of our mouths? What message do we share, not forced, but organically? Does the thunder roll from us? If not, the question is, did lightning strike us? That's harsh, but that's physics, right? No lightning, no thunder. Small lightning, small thunder. Big lightning, big thunder. What was the lightning strike like in your life? What impact has God had in your life? It's possible to absolutely be born again, be a believer, be a Christian, and to personally marginalize the impact that God has had in your life to such a degree that you have no thunder. So I'm not here to say you have no thunder, you must not be saved. That's possible, but it is possible to minimize God's impact because He doesn't force Himself on us. He'll only have the impact in your life that we let Him have. So how's your thunder this morning? Does it echo into our city? Does it echo into our region? Or is it something the keenest cat with the best hearing struggles to hear? Only you can know the answer. But I think that answer is telling on what kind of impact God has had in your life and how that lives out. Again, passive, natural, a result of the impact in His life, thundering out. It's not try harder. It's just let God do more. Let God be more. The thunder will follow naturally. Just stand with me as we close this morning in prayer. Our Father, we thank You for the words of the Apostle Paul. This idea of thunder that we can wrap our hearts and minds around that captivates our focus and attention. It's something that we've heard before. Help us, Father, to long to hear it in our own lives. Father, would You help us to assess ourselves? How much do we limit You versus how much do we let You impact us? Not doing more to share more, not doing more to read more, to pray more, to do all the things more. But just to rest in You and let You do more through us. Father, that's our prayer as individuals. That's our prayer as a church. That the thunder would roll from here. Because we're a collection of people who've been impacted by You. Father, would You take us from this place today? Would You bury this message deep in our hearts so that we don't lose it in the excitement of this afternoon's, evening's events? But as the week progresses, maybe You'd send us a thunderstorm to remind us. To let You impact our lives. Father, would You help us carry the message with us? Help us to carry Your message with us, not in a forced way, but because it's on our hearts and minds. Father, would You keep us safe? Would You keep us effective? Would You draw us back again next week, we pray in Jesus' good name.